Okay, we talked before about the concept of presumption of innocence, where you don't punish somebody unless you actually have proof that they did something wrong. So you start with the assumption that they didn't do it and then see if there's enough evidence, reliable evidence, to prove that they actually did. And again, the fact that this is used in courts of law, like they sort of apply it, and then there's weird ways they try to get around it and things like that, such as plea bargains, where they basically say, if you just admit that you did it, then we will punish you not quite as hard. But if you make us prove it, then we'll punish you harder. And a lot of people basically confess. And so there isn't presumption of innocence. There's, well, we're going to make you confess. And we're going to get into that a little bit later when we get to the concept of the right to remain silent, which I'm sure you've heard. But a thing that ties in very closely with the presumption of innocence is the concept of burden of proof. And you may have heard that term in TV shows or whatever. It's basically starting with the idea that one party, like if there's a disagreement, like let's say, again, the example of the neighbor whose car just went missing, and he says, I bet my neighbor did it. I don't like him, and he doesn't like me. And the other neighbor says, I didn't do it. Well, who has the burden of proof? That means, what do you start with assuming? Do you assume, okay, we're all going to assume you're guilty unless you can prove that you're innocent? Ready, go. That would be putting the burden of proof on the accused. And we've talked before about why you don't do that. That's totally unfair. And I gave the example of if you were falsely accused and somebody said, okay, now prove to me you didn't do this. You might be like, I can't. Maybe you don't have an alibi. You were just at home, but you didn't talk to anybody. And like, how am I supposed to prove I'm innocent when you totally are? So in that case, the burden of proof is on the accuser and the ones trying to prove the person's guilt. All right, we're going to start with the presumption of innocence. We're going to assume that he's didn't do it unless and until you can carry that burden and prove that he did do it. And there is a similar concept when it comes to what's called civil cases, where it's not a criminal case. It's not somebody accused of a crime. It's like, well, I'm suing you because I tripped on your front path and I think you were negligent in having that way. So you're not being charged with a crime and thrown in jail, but I'm suing you for $5,000 because I hurt my knee because I tripped on your path because I think your path should have been smoother. And those are known as civil cases where nobody's threatened with jail. It's just people arguing over money, like I'm going to sue you. That's almost always a civil case. And again, there are rules about burden of proof there. But if you think about it, whether it's a really serious accusation, like somebody says, you murdered 5 people, or whether it's like, hey, you let your shopping cart bump into my car and it made a tiny scratch in the metal, there's still the concept of the burden of proof. And for some things, the burden is like, well, it's not that humongously important that we know for absolute certainty what happened. Like if we're going to stick someone in the electric chair for murdering 5 people, we really need to know if he murdered 5 people. We can't just go, I don't know, we kind of think he probably did. Like, that's horrible. That's just as bad as somebody murdering somebody else. So the burden of proof in civil cases is often not beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's the preponderance of the evidence, as in most of the evidence seems to show that it's this rather than that. And that's a lower threshold. It's a lower thing to have to prove. But there's still burden of proof in civil cases and criminal cases. In sort of any case like that, the burden of proof just means, all right, whoever's making this claim, you're the one who actually has to prove it. You can't just go to your neighbor and say, you killed my cat. Prove that you didn't. Like, how is your neighbor supposed to prove he didn't kill your cat? And so the concept of burden of proof is just, it's another way to look at the presumption of innocence, is saying you can't put it on the accused to prove his innocence before there's any reason to think he did it. Now, the accused is allowed to defend himself and say, wait a minute, you accused me of this, but I wasn't even here. And like, it's not that he's not allowed to defend himself and prove he didn't do it. It's that the burden isn't on him. The assumption isn't that he did it until he proves he didn't. The assumption is that he didn't. In other words, we're not going to punish you and hurt you based on a guess. Somebody else has the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt, or in a civil case, preponderance of the evidence, or whatever the threshold is, of proving that you actually did something wrong or something was your fault. And so that's a very basic concept of there has to be some sort of threshold of we need enough to demonstrate this before we're going to do anything. We're not just going to go on a hunch or a baseless accusation. Somebody has to prove something, and it's always the one accusing. It's not the one sitting around minding his own business and suddenly, wait, I have to prove something? I didn't do anything. So it's really just another way to look at presumption of innocence. Okay, now I'm sure you've heard on TV dramas or in the news all over the place the word indictment, and most people still don't seem to know what that means. A lot of people confuse that with conviction. Like, oh, you were indicted for doing something. And, well, that sounds really bad. And maybe it is really bad. But what does it actually mean? And most people don't even know. It ties into the concepts of burden of proof. It also ties into warrants, which we're going to get to later. An indictment just means we think there is enough evidence that you are now formally accused of this crime. It hasn't been proven yet. It's not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not proven at all. There hasn't been a trial yet. It just means there's enough evidence that we're going to take this to trial or that we're going to formally accuse you. And maybe the person will say guilty or not guilty or, whatever things may happen after that. But an indictment is just, we think there's enough to say it's pretty likely you did this. Not beyond a reasonable doubt. We're not sure, but it's pretty likely. So that's called an indictment. Incidentally, that's spelled INDICTMENT. So if you read it in the newspaper and go, what's an indictment? That's how you spell indictment. I don't know why, don't care. But an indictment just means there's enough evidence that we're going to take you to trial. A conviction means we took you to trial and the evidence proved you were guilty, or at least that's what the jury or the judge decided. And now you're actually going to be punished. But a lot of people get indicted for things and then they get let off, or the charges, you'll hear he was indicted for this, but then the charges were dropped, which means we thought we had enough evidence. It's not a very high threshold. It's not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but it proves that there's a reason to be suspicious that you did this. And then they'll say either, well, we're dropping the case because we don't actually have enough evidence to prove it. Even if you did do it, we had enough evidence to indict you, but not enough to prove guilt. Or they find out, oh, whoops, you didn't actually do it. It just, this evidence made it look like you did, but you didn't really, whoops. And once again, there's a difference between the way government actually does these things and the way a rational moral society would apply these concepts. Because if you imagine somebody being accused of stealing a car and you say, we're going to put you on trial and you have to show up and we're going to accuse you and we're going to have witnesses and testimony, somebody might say, wait, that's a pretty big harassment if the guy didn't do it. Shouldn't there be some lower threshold where we at least have some reason that we all go, yeah, I guess it's kind of likely he did that before we start questioning him and going through all this? Or can anybody just make up a accusation and then we'll go harass and hound this guy and put him on trial for something that we have no reason to even suspect that he did, much less proof. So the concept of an indictment makes sense completely outside of like the legal system, just on a moral basis. Is you don't just the witch trials. Well, somebody said that somebody else said that, put her on trial. It's like, wait a minute. First of all, that's going to be terrifying for her. I don't want to terrify somebody based on somebody said that somebody else suspected something. Now, if there's enough evidence against somebody for an actual crime, not witchcraft, like for an actual crime, if there's enough evidence to say, yeah, it's kind of looking like he probably did it. It's not all the way proven yet, but it's looking like he did it. Now we just as decent human beings say, well, okay, it's bad enough that now we probably have to put him through the process of a trial and testimony and things like that. So that first step in the legal system is referred to as an indictment. And so a cop, for example, a cop can't just pick you up on the street and put you on trial for selling drugs based on absolutely nothing. Like, there's no evidence. They didn't catch you with anything. Nobody said anything. They just decided to accuse you, to drag you through the process and dramatize the hell out of you in court, based on an accusation of something you didn't do, but based on nothing. So they first have to get an indictment, or they have to get a warrant. We're going to get into that later on. But the concept of that is just before we do anything, before we even like publicly announce, we think you did this, or we think maybe you did this, there has to be some threshold to even get that far to put somebody through that level of accusation. And unfortunately, when it comes to rumors and people gossiping, there is no such thing. So a bunch of people, like a very common one, which is, it's very sad in all directions. When somebody gets, accused of inappropriate conduct or assault or something because somebody said they did. And it's like, okay, if they really did that, we really want to know, and we really want to do something about it, because that's bad. But there have also been a lot of cases where somebody just made that up and there was no real evidence, and they just made it up to hurt the other person, and it destroyed their career. And people get suicidal and stuff if they're publicly accused of something horrible that they never did, that they never would have dreamed of doing, but somebody else decided to say, you did this. And it's so stressful and horrible having the whole world think you did something horrible, even when you totally didn't, that is, that can hurt somebody all by itself, even if in the long run, it comes out that, oh, they didn't really do that. The person just made it up. And that happens. It happens pretty often. And so this is a fine example of why it's so important for people to grasp the concept of presumption of innocence and rules of evidence and things like that. Because it's so easy for somebody to want to jump to a conclusion. Like, well, I hear this person saying that her boss did these nasty things. Okay, well, if you don't know either of them, all you know is that there was an accusation. Maybe something bad happened. Maybe the boss did something nasty and we want to know and we want to figure out what to do about it. Or maybe the woman was about to get fired or was trying to get a raise and bribing him and made it up. If you don't know, you can't dive in with your emotions and go, well, I'm just going to guess that he did it. Well, I'm going to guess that she's lying. Like the whole concept of presumption of innocence and burden of proof and rules of evidence and all the things we've been talking about are, don't fly off the handle until we actually know, until we do the best we can at determining what really happened and then decide what to do about it. But way too often people go on their hunches and emotions and lives are destroyed. Either an accuser who's accusing somebody of something they actually did, and then the accuser gets bashed and demonized and vilified and all that when they were actually telling the truth, or they falsely accuse somebody and that person gets bashed and fired or shunned by everybody or publicly, slammed and insulted and condemned and everything for something they didn't even do. So that's the concept of justice is, okay, before we do anything, we have to do as much as we possibly can to determine what's true and then go from there deciding what to do about it. And unfortunately, most people don't do that. They want to jump to thinking that, well, I know he did it because I kind of have a hunch and like he's rich and I don't like rich people. So I'm going to decide that he did it. Well, maybe he did it and maybe he didn't, but your hunch doesn't determine whether he did it or not. And if you use your hunch to punish somebody and then it turns out they didn't do it, then you have wrongly harmed somebody. So that's the entire concept of justice is try to protect the innocent, whether it's somebody who's actually the victim of a crime or somebody who is falsely accused of harming somebody else. And that takes going through, trying to remain rational, which can be difficult if you're talking about a really heinous crime. It's difficult to stay rational and calm and say, okay, he's accused of something completely heinous. I don't know if he actually did it or not. If he did it, that's really not okay. and we're going to do something really unpleasant to him about it, if that's your position. But trying to remain calm until you actually know what happened, until you carefully figure out based on the evidence, did this really happen? Did he really do it? Instead of getting so emotionally charged that the evidence stops mattering because you're just so angry in either direction. And even lawyers totally know how to play on emotions to, for the jury, if they don't actually have enough evidence of guilt, they'll be like, it's so sad that this happened to the victim. Yeah. And that says exactly nothing about whether that person is actually the one who committed the crime. But so when they appeal to emotions because they don't have evidence, that's just slimy. That's the exact opposite of how justice really needs to work. Yeah, once you know what happened, be as emotional and indignant and outraged as you want about, actual injustices, but don't skip the concept of evidence and logic because your emotions are getting in the way. So this all these concepts you can see they tie in and tie together. But this was really supposed to just be about the concept of an indictment, of enough to actually formally accuse somebody of, we think you did this. Now we're going to see if we can actually prove it. So that's what an indictment is. Next, let's talk about juries and trials. In the U.S., one of the things you have a right to is a trial by a jury of your peers. Now, why? Why is there such a thing? Again, a lot of this is about, where did these ideas come from? Now, maybe government has warped and hijacked and mangled them since then, but often these ideas came from very good ideas from moral, intelligent people who wanted to protect the innocent. Again, protect the innocent victim of a crime and protect the innocent who were falsely accused of a crime for whatever reason, mistaken identity or malice or anything else. So the concept of a jury trial is that, well, when it comes to this burden of proof, that we have to prove that this person did it. Again, let's go back to our example of guy whose car goes missing and he suspects his neighbor of stealing his car. If there's enough evidence to even go to a trial, to get an indictment and go to a trial, the burden of proof, well, who's measuring what counts as proof? Who's deciding whether it was proven or not? Because the victim may be so sort of outraged and so suspecting of his neighbor that he says, well, I saw him walking past my house yesterday. That's proof enough. And everybody else might say, that isn't proof that he stole your car. So who's deciding what the proof is? The concept of a jury trial is to say, all right, if this set of people, 9, 12, 6, 3, 100, whatever size the jury is, if this set of people all say, yeah, we think that proves that he actually did it, and unanimously say that, we're going to say, well, that's a pretty good proof. If you can convince all these people that every single one of them each says, yeah, I think that proves that he did it, then you've met the burden of proof. If they all say, we think you've proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he actually did this bad thing, okay, now it's settled. Now we have to decide what to do about it. But the concept of a jury is, we're not just going to buy off one person and he'll say, yeah, he did it. Okay, that's proof. And the concept of a jury of your peers is supposed to mean, well, originally it was supposed to mean a jury of the people in the same area of the same, often it was people who knew you, like people in the neighborhood, people in the area. Now it's way more spread out than that, and it's usually complete strangers. But the concept is it's supposed to be randomly selected people, which it isn't really in our judicial system. But it's kind of sort of trying to be that in some ways. But the idea is the accuser isn't going to be neutral. If he thinks you totally did it, well, if he thinks that, he's obviously biased. Maybe he's right. Maybe he's wrong, but he's totally biased. And the one who's accused, who says, I didn't do it, well, he's going to say he didn't do it whether he did or not. So his opinion doesn't matter. But if you bring in, as far as other people trying to figure out what actually happened and what the truth is, But if you bring in a bunch of random people and say, all right, you're going to sit here and listen to this evidence and see what you think. And if half of them go, I think he did it, and the other half goes, I don't think he really proved it, the concept of burden of proof and presumption of innocence dictates that, well, we're going to let him go. Because half of you decided that wasn't really proven. Like, sort of some evidence that maybe suggests it, but maybe he totally didn't. And I don't want to punish an innocent person just because it kind of sort of looked like he did it. So in this country, generally speaking, there are judges who do tricks to overrule this. In a criminal trial, it's supposed to be a unanimous verdict. So if you have the whole trial and one person says, I don't really think you proved it, I can still imagine that he's innocent. And the evidence just, a bunch of it makes it look guilty, but there are holes in the story. There are things that make me not all the way convinced that he did it. Then the concept of burden of proof and presumption of innocence says, well, then we're not going to punish the guy. If even one person said, no. Now, often that's called a hung jury, and you may hear this in the news or on TV and stuff. A hung jury means we couldn't all reach the same conclusion. Let's say 11 of us said, we're pretty dang sure he did it. We're going to say guilty. And one says, I'm not all the way sure. Well, that doesn't count as guilty. That counts as a hung jury. They couldn't all agree. If they all say not guilty, that's the end. He goes away. If they all say guilty, then they move on to, all right, what are we going to do about it? But a hung jury is where, we couldn't agree with each other on what to do. And sometimes that goes back and goes, well, then we're going to get a new jury and start all over again. Or sometimes the prosecution, which now is the government, will say, well, we're just going to give up, because if we went through all our evidence and we still couldn't convince 12 people, then it's probably going to happen again and again and again, and we're just going to do this forever. And the problem with, again, there's the underlying concepts, and then there's what the government version does. There's the concept of double jeopardy, which is you can't be prosecuted twice for the same crime. And so that brings up the thing of, well, if the jury says, if one guy says, we don't think he did it, can you go back and try him all over again and say, well, we're going to bring in a new jury and then see if we can convince them that he did it. And so there are things that do and don't count as double jeopardy under our system. So often there'll be something called a mistrial, when they're going along and one of the lawyers or something says something that they weren't supposed to say. It's not admissible as evidence. Maybe it's just totally false. But the fact that the jury heard it makes the judge decide they can't be unbiased and neutral anymore. The concept of rules of evidence is what is the jury allowed to hear? They're not allowed to hear a bunch of irrelevant, damning stuff that may not even be true, that makes the person look really bad, because somewhere in the back of their minds they're going to think, wow, that guy's a bad guy. I guess he probably did it. And that it wasn't supposed to be their job. So the concept of a mistrial is one of the parties did something so bad that we have to just crash that entire trial and start all the way over. And that they won't count as double jeopardy, because it never got to the end. There wasn't actually a verdict. But so there's a difference between that and, we put you on trial and the jury said not guilty, but we don't like you, so we're going to put you on trial again for the same thing. And they're not allowed to do that. But again, there are in-between rules that they finagle to try to kind of get away with that again. But you can still imagine the rational basis of that if this guy was accused and they put all the evidence in front of, not even a government, but a bunch of people heard the evidence and they said, I don't think that proves he did it. And if you turn around and say, well, then we're going to bring in another group of people and start over until we get a group that says he did it. Well, okay, that's not trying to find the truth. That's trying to get a certain outcome. And that's the concept of a jury, is to guard against that. If you can't convince on your first shot this group of randomly selected people, if you can't convince them with the evidence you have that this guy did it and convince them beyond a reasonable doubt, then you have to let him go. You can't punish him based on, well, he probably did it. That's not good enough. And the concept of a jury is, we're not going to take your word for it. We're not going to take his word for it when he says, I didn't do it. We need random, neutral, objective people to be the deciders of whether you reach the burden of proof. And unfortunately, in this country, a lot of the time, the decider literally works for the same team as the prosecutor, which is the judges that are paid by government and the prosecution that's paid by government and works for government and is a government employee. And the judge, who is a government employee, is pretending to be the objective decider of whether the burden of proof was met. And here's the defendant going, wait a minute, you guys work on the same team. How is this objective? So the concept of being able to demand a jury trial that we have in the US, in a lot of cases, they try to get around that in certain ways. But the concept of having a right to a jury trial is you can't leave this up to the decision of somebody who works for the same people that the prosecutor works for. It needs to be somebody neutral. So they bring in juries. They bring in presumably randomly selected people. And if they can prove it to them, then the jury says, oh, okay, well, we think you proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, now you can move forward to the punishment phase or whatever you want to call it. So that's the purpose of a jury, is if you can't take some random people off the street and convince them that he did it, if you don't have enough evidence to do that, then you don't have enough evidence to punish the guy. You haven't met the burden of proof. You can't just presume he's guilty because you kind of sort of think so. If you can't get normal people to go, yeah, looking at your evidence, it looks pretty much like he did it. If they can't do that, then you're not justified in doing anything to him. And you could totally apply that concept outside of government and legislative and all that stuff. Just if you're living in some place that doesn't have a ruling class, but people are still trying to be careful to protect the innocent, you could still totally, and probably would, have something like juries. And it may be the whole town. Maybe everybody gets, if it's a little town, everybody gets together and go, all right, he's accusing him of stealing his car. And here's the evidence. And everybody's sitting there going, okay, well, what about this? And, you go through it. And if everybody goes, I don't really think you proved it. And everybody goes, okay, go home. Like, we're not doing anything about it. Maybe he even did it. But if we can't prove it, we're not doing anything about it because we would rather let a guilty person get away with a crime here and there than to punish an innocent person. And that's the purpose of most of these principles. So that's what a jury is for. And that's what the trial is for, to put the evidence in front of those people so that they have all the evidence to make the decision of whether they think that proved guilt. Let's talk about the concept of probable cause. You've probably heard this if you watch like TV crime shows. It comes into play when it comes to warrants, which is like search warrants and arrest warrants. Probable cause doesn't mean I all the way have absolute proof that you committed a crime. It means I have enough evidence that you committed a crime to actually do something about it. So, for example, if you're walking down the street, again, we're going to do a version that doesn't have government and cops in it, because a lot of these principles are just what people figured out over the centuries of the way we have to think in order to provide justice in the best way we as, flawed mortals possibly can. So you're walking down the street and you hear, no, he's killing me, coming from a house. And you run up to the front door and you're knocking like, are you okay? Like, it's kind of societally accepted. You're allowed to walk up to a front door and knock on it. It's not accepted that you can just barge into somebody's house to see if they're doing something you don't approve of. So the concept of probable cause is, do I have in a general sense, not the legal sense yet, do I have enough of a reason to like barge into this person's house? Like, I hear somebody yelling, but maybe was that on the TV, or are they acting, or they're lying, or what? Like, at what point do I think I have the right to barge in and intervene? And so that's what the concept of probable cause is. Now, in a legal sense, when the police want to get an arrest warrant, which means we're going to come take you into custody, or a search warrant, which means we're going to rummage through your stuff, or rummage through your car, rummage through your house, whatever. And the Fourth Amendment says that they're not allowed to do searches and seizures without probable cause, and they use probable cause to get a warrant. Once again, just like the trial thing, they're not going to leave it up to the cop to decide, well, I decided it was enough of a reason to do this. So a warrant is they're supposed to say, here's what we know. Here's the evidence we have so far that leads us to believe that there's, something horrible going on in this house. Like there's a murder was committed in there. And they go to a judge and they say, here's what we know. Here's our evidence. Will you, the judge, sign off on a search warrant that gives us legal permission to barge into the house and see if there is like a dead body or whatever? That's the point of a search warrant. So the cops can't just say, well, I was kind of suspicious and I decided that was enough of justification, so I'm going to barge in. And I get to because I have a badge and I decided that. It's trying to get somebody neutral and objective to have to decide, okay, based on what you're telling me, yeah, I think it might be necessary and justified to barge into this person's house without their permission, which is usually, a pretty serious thing to do. And you're not supposed to do that unless you really have a good reason, especially in somebody's home. So there's this threshold of proof called probable cause that in theory, you're supposed to meet that proof to get an arrest warrant. And again, it doesn't mean you're convicted, we know you did it. It just means we're taking you into custody. And again, these are sort of the in-between steps before someone's been proven guilty. Because if people are pretty sure that their neighbor just like murdered his wife or something, there's the end, which is all the way proving it. But in between, it's like, well, do we just let him go on his merry way because we haven't proven it yet? Like, because to physically stop somebody and to take them into custody, that's a pretty serious thing. You shouldn't just do that on a hunch that, well, I think maybe you did something wrong, so I'm going to tackle you and tie you to a tree. Like, that's not okay. But on the other end of the spectrum, if, you hear bloody murder and screaming and, he's killing me, and then he comes out the front door wiping blood off his hands, like, at what point do you say, okay, we may not have proof that he did it yet, because maybe there is some other explanation for that, but we kind of have reason to think maybe he did, and so we detain him, arrest him, we take him hostage, because we have pretty good reason to think that he might have done that. And not just a hunch, but we have really solid reason that like a bunch of witnesses saw him coming out, washing blood off his hands, and heard somebody screaming, he's killing me. Like, okay, that witness testimony is enough that I would call that probable cause to think he did something bad, at least enough to confront him and say, what's going on? And if he says, oh, sorry, I was just, I was preparing steaks and we're watching a really loud movie. Sorry. Like, you might suddenly turn around and go, oh, okay, it just sounded worse. Or if he goes, nothing, you might go, okay, we kind of have to detain you until we figure out what's going on. So a lot of the concept of probable cause and warrants, arrest warrants and search warrants, is like, for now, we have to do something to you that's, normally not okay to do to somebody, whether taking them hostage or barging into their house and rummaging through their stuff, looking for evidence, or both. We think we have enough to justify that, even though we don't yet have enough evidence to actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you did it. In fact, the concept of a search warrant is that we have enough evidence to justify barging into your house or your car or whatever and rummaging around in your stuff. The goal of that being to find enough evidence to actually prove that you did it, or to find out that that evidence doesn't exist and go, whoops, okay, we were totally unjustified. We thought we had enough reason to do that. But turns out you didn't really do it. You just looked really suspicious because of this and this and this. But that's the concept of a warrant. And again, it's sort of like the indictment thing where a lot of people hear it and go, oh, he was arrested. That means he's guilty. No, it doesn't. Or there was a search warrant. They raided his business or they raided his house or whatever. He must have done something bad. And it's easy for people's emotions to make them jump to these conclusions, especially if they don't really understand what these different levels of procedure are, which is one of the reasons I'm making this video series, is so people have a better understanding. Because a lot of times there'll be a search warrant and the cops will show up and kick down a door and barge in and rummage around and go, we didn't find anything. A lot of the time on drug charges, they do that. And that should make people very suspicious of, wait, how did you get a search warrant over and over and over again for all these places, and then you didn't find anything on all those raids. You know, a bunch of guys show up with guns and kick a door down, tear a house apart and go, oh, we didn't find anything. Whoops. Well, then what was your evidence to justify the raid? Because in theory, not in practice, but in theory in the US, you have to already have enough evidence that a judge says, yep, it's pretty dang likely that they're breaking some law in there. So I'm going to sign off on this warrant that tells the cops that they're allowed to barge in without the guy's permission, break in if they have to, and do all that. So every time they break in, rummage around and say, nope, we didn't find anything, the question should immediately be, wait a minute, what was your probable cause to begin with? Because the truth of the matter is, it's way too easy for the cops to get a warrant. They don't need probable cause. They need to know some judge who's their buddy. And this may sound extreme and radical, but it happens all the time that they do raids and find nothing, which means their probable cause was based either on lies or fabrications, or maybe a drastic misunderstanding of something. But it's usually, it's the same thing with indictments too. There's the saying that they can indict a ham sandwich. There's supposed to be a threshold of there's enough evidence to formally charge you with this crime. But the reality in this country is getting an indictment is just ridiculously easy. You need hardly anything to get a grand jury. And there's different ways. There's an information. There's different like procedural versions of it. But one way is a grand jury indictment where a grand jury goes, yeah, there's some reason to kind of think maybe he did that. So you can charge him with it. Doesn't mean he's proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But we'll give you this indictment. And it's just way too, it's an open running joke of they can indict a ham sandwich if they want to. And unfortunately, it's the same thing with warrants now. They can get a warrant really easily when they have nowhere near what any rational human being would call probable cause to actually be pretty sure that there's a crime going on. And they do it all the time, which is why they do raids all the time and they don't find anything. And most people don't even think to say, wait, why were you allowed to raid his house at all? Like, why did you think you were going to find something? And most people don't question that and they never follow up on it and the news doesn't report about it and they don't go back to the cops and say, wait, you did this big raid and found nothing. What was the justification for the raid to begin with? Let me see the application for the search warrant because that's what the cops fill out to give to the judge and say, here's what we know. Did you actually have a reason? And very often it's some informant, and we're not going to tell you their name, said that things are happening in there. Well, okay, who's that? Do we get to know who it is? No. Is it maybe some guy that the cops pay to make stuff up? Yeah, literally happens all the time. They've been caught doing it over and over and over again. Well, that should not be considered probable cause enough to barge into somebody's house. And you would very much know that if your house was the one they barged into, because somebody who doesn't like you said, yeah, he has, a meth lab in there or something, and just made it up to the police. The police were like, oh, that's good enough for us. Let's get the SWAT gear and go kick down your door. If you're there with people pointing machine guns at you and you find out that their probable cause that they got a warrant based on was just, oh, somebody who doesn't like you just said this, you'd probably be outraged, and rightly so. And unfortunately, because there should be a much higher threshold before they do that to anybody. And unfortunately, now the threshold for a warrant or the threshold for an indictment is pretty much non-existent. They can get them whenever they want. And there's actually, in the news, there has been, what do they call it? They call it swatting, where somebody as a prank or to be mean to somebody else calls the cops anonymously and reports them for having a meth lab or something. And the SWAT team shows up and barges in as if some random person making a phone call is good enough for probable cause to do an armed invasion of somebody's house. But the reason that happens at all is because people know damn well that that's all it takes to get a warrant and to get an armed invasion of somebody's house. Nothing like actual probable cause. Some random person saying that they heard something or saw something. Oh, that's good enough for us. We'll go to this judge. He'll rubber stamp it without even reading it, probably. And then we'll barge in and go, oh, there wasn't anything. Whoops. Or we'll accidentally shoot somebody and go, whoops. Well, we had a warrant based on nothing. So once again, the government version very often doesn't match the underlying concept, but the underlying concept of probable cause and warrants is a very good one, which is we're not going to tackle somebody and take them hostage, or we're not going to barge into their house and rummage around in their stuff unless we already have a pretty good reason to think that they probably did something really bad. And then we have to go through the process of seeing if we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. But to do anything, to detain somebody, you can't just walk up to somebody and say, I'm going to tie you to a tree and then rummage through your house just to see if you were doing anything bad. I mean, that's all the way fascism. And the purpose of the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and a bunch of these rules is to try to make that not happen. And unfortunately, we're getting closer and closer to that being the reality. But outside of the legal system, rational, moral people should understand, even if you sort of suspect somebody of doing something, even something really bad, you don't tackle them and tie them up and rummage through their stuff based on somebody hearing somebody else saying that they thought maybe something happened. Like, that's not good enough. If you're going to inflict that on another human being, you better have a really good reason. And the technical description of that really good reason is probable cause. It's very probable this person did a nasty thing. I therefore have cause to tackle him and detain him and rummage through his stuff and whatever else. But there's a reason for that concept, aside from what the U.S. And other judicial systems have made that into, in the way they've corrupted and mangled and ignored it. But that's the concept of probable cause.